Hello? That sounds more promising. Good afternoon. I'm Victoria Schofield. And firstly, I'd like to say how wonderful it is to be in this fabulous city of Lahore. I'm glad the sun has come out to greet us today. And to thank the organizers of the Lahore Literary Festival for inviting me. I'd also like to thank you all for coming this afternoon and not wanting to get filthy rich in South Asia. Or indeed go to any of the other sessions. So it's really great that you're here. As we know, Benazir Bhutto, regardless of your political affiliation, was an iconic figure. She was a force of nature, and she affected many, not just in Pakistan, but worldwide. My own history with her began in October 1974, when I was in a crush in the Oxford Union bar, and someone said, did I want to meet the daughter of Prime Minister of Pakistan? I'm afraid in those days I barely knew where Pakistan is, and that's nothing to do with how wonderful Pakistan is, but my own ignorance as an undergraduate. And we met, and we made a firm friendship ever since. She affected my writing career, my family, and my children, for whom she was always Benazir Khala. After her death, a documentary was made which wonderfully included tapes which Linda Bird Franke recorded when she was helping her to write her Benazir's autobiography, Daughter of the East. And shortly we're going to see a few clips. The first clip that we're hopefully going to see if technology is working is a clip which I believe really defined Benazir's life. And regardless of retrospective comments about her political ambitions, I know, because I was with her at the time, that the death of her father is what projected her and propelled her into politics. She took up her father's political mantle. And so if we could just have that first clip, I think it will set the scene for what we're going to be talking about later.
Oh, it's there.
Have we got the sound?
And he talked to family matters, he talked to party matters, and I keep seeing his face. I said that I'd like to hug my father goodbye. He'd been the president, the prime minister, he'd brought them back from the camps of India. They wouldn't even open the cell door for me to kiss him goodbye. Said, this is goodbye until the final meeting. And those were the last words he spoke to either my mother or myself.
Well, it was an extraordinary time, and I was fortunate and unfortunate in a way that I lived in Pakistan during 1978-79. And so I witnessed so many of these events which affected her life. Now, sitting with me is Linda Bird Franke, who entered Benazir Bhutto's life, I think, a decade later, because she was asked to write Benazir's autobiography, Daughter of the East, Daughter of Destiny, as it became in the United States. And it's an extraordinary story as well, because here we have a woman who is really at the threshold of her political career, writing her autobiography. So, Linda, my first question to you is, how did you come to write the book?
Well, I first met Benazir on in the pages of the New York Times Sunday magazine. There was an amazing article written about her after her return to Lahore. And it was the picture that captivated me. This beautiful, beautiful young woman riding in a bus or a truck, I can't remember what it was, but garishly painted from the American point of view, because we're all sort of brown and black, and covered with rose petals. There were just rose petals, and I thought, who is this woman? And of course the story that accompanied the picture told all, you know, and the death of her father, the death of her brother, her imprisonment off and on in detention, 7 years worth. And I was so struck at looking at this gorgeous young woman what she was doing in this political world when she could have been, I don't know, what, a model or an actress or something. Anyway, I was very moved by it all. And then the phone rang, and it was her agent, her literary agent, Andrew Wiley, was saying to me, how would you like to write Benazir Bhutto's memoir? And I said, are you kidding? I was thrilled. So I was on the plane to Karachi as soon as I could. And that was in 1987, I guess I arrived. Not to a very friendly welcome, I must tell you. Benazir was away. We were supposed to, I was with my husband and an editorial assistant, but we stayed at the Holiday Inn or someplace for a day. And the very first night in Karachi, we got mugged by some Afghans, it turned out. So we went to the U.S. Embassy thinking, well, we should check in with the U.S. Embassy. And they would not see us because Benazir, they said, was a troublemaker. This was, Ronald Reagan was president then and was a firm supporter of General Zia. Republicans do love dictators. And so we were just totally thrown to the wind by the U.S. Embassy, to the point where I had just finished the Jahan Sadat. I'd done a book with her. Her manuscript was sent to Pakistan for us for the final edit, and the U.S. Embassy refused to deliver it. They wouldn't go near 70 Clifton.
Well, I think we have to remember that in 1987, which is a long time ago for a number of people in the audience, Pakistan was under a military dictatorship, which was a very different military dictatorship, and I certainly also lived under it from the dictatorship of President Pervez Musharraf. And so your story is utterly credible. But you got on, everything got sorted eventually, and you started collaborating with her. Can you just tell me, why did she not feel confident enough? She was an Oxford undergraduate, Oxford graduate. Why did she not want to write the book herself? Why did she ask you to do it in particular?
Well, I don't know why it was me, per se.
But to have a ghostwriter, to have somebody to work with.
Well, I don't think she had the time. I mean, this happens with a lot of the women that I've worked with. They're very, very busy, and they don't have the time. It takes time, as you know, Victoria,
sure.
To write. But I want to make the distinction between being a ghostwriter, where you really sort of just make up a story about something, and a collaboration, which is what I do. So I spent hours and hours and hours with Benazir taping.
With tapes.
Yeah.
The important tapes, yes.
And then you weave what she says, and you get her tone of voice and her inflections and what have you into the written word.
And what was she like to work with in terms of being a collaborator? But as we know, she also was a very independent-minded person. How did you find her? Because you didn't really know her until you started the collaboration.
No, I certainly did not. Well, we got along amazingly well. She was very disciplined, which, of course, I appreciated so much. And our contract called for, I think, at least an hour a day that she would spend with me, and she did. And it quickly developed that the best time of day was breakfast. So I would go to her bedroom and sit on the edge of her bed with the tape recorder and eat half her breakfast and, go on with the taping. And she never missed an hour, never. On the road, in Karachi, Lahore, no matter where we were. I went everywhere with her. She took me everywhere.
And did you do it chronologically? I mean, did you start with her birth and her childhood and everything, or did she prefer to talk about certain subjects at certain times when she was in the mood?
No, I always go chronologically. That doesn't mean that's the way it ends up in the book. But I couldn't start, with the death of her father, for example. We had to establish a relationship and some degree of trust before we got to these really...
To the sensitive episodes.
To the sensitive bit. And it was already, I felt, very sensitive because we were staying in the little guest house where her brothers lived, and their clothes were still hanging in the closets.
Well, of course, the brothers, by this time, as we all know, had gone to Afghanistan and then taken up residence, one in France and one in Syria. And
one had been murdered.
And one... Well, no, I was just coming on to that. Then yes, one had already been murdered, but you had to, having also, you would have to deal with the death of her father, which, as we know, was very traumatic for her. But in 1985, she had this other huge trauma, which was the death of Shahnawaz, her younger brother. So, I mean, there were events that were very raw in terms of working with her.
There were, and she did not hold back. She was really, she was remarkable. She was very emotional when she felt emotional. She was angry when she felt angry. She was, you know, she was really, of all the women I have done books with, I think that she was the most honest and forthright and transparent in
Do you think in some way it was cathartic for her as well? Because at the same time as having to go over some of the tragedy of her life, she was also talking about it almost sort of in a way for the first time.
I think so. And I think that at the time that we did this book, she was in a perilous position in Pakistan,
yes,
with Zia very firmly in power. And I've always had the feeling, though I can't substantiate it with anything, that she wrote the book more or less to keep herself alive. She had quite a big following in America. Her great friend from Harvard, Peter Galbraith, who worked for the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, and he brought in a senator who was very vocal on her behalf. And so by keeping her story alive in America, I think it was helping keeping her alive in Pakistan.
Yes, well, I think it was. I do know myself from my own experience with her that very much she always felt the power of the Western media. She felt this particularly also with the trial and subsequent execution of her father. If only the West would know what was going on, somehow it wouldn't happen. And I think she did feel for herself that she wanted to appraise the West. She was very conscious of the power of the international media, and also she really liked the West. She'd spent 4 years in Harvard, 4 years at Oxford, so she understood the West.
Yeah.
And so perhaps can we just perhaps now see that little clip where she does indeed talk about the death of Shahnawaz Bhutto, because again, it's a little known part of her narrative, but losing her brother, who was only, I think, 25 at that time, was another tragedy that she had to put up to deal with. And I know also was one of the reasons why she went back to Pakistan in 1984, because 1986, sorry, 86, because she felt the love of the people when she came back to bury him. That's certainly what she told me. Can we just see if that works now?
Go inside.
It's not very good quality, I apologize.
And he was lying on the carpet, man without sex, and he just looked like a sleeping animal. He was so handsome. He said to me, he's dead. I said, no, try. He said, he's cold. He's been dead for hours. And I shouted, you killed him, you killed him, you killed him. Without a shadow of doubt, I feel that he was most cruelly, heartlessly murdered. Well, we would like the French police to find out, but we think it took place within a political context.
Going back with his body. That was me on the film, sorry, we don't want to go into that one. So it was a really tragic story you were writing about, perhaps more tragic than others that you've written. There must have been some light moments, some events that made you laugh while you were sitting with her.
Oh, yeah. Oh, we had a lot of fun together. One of them, in terms of working with her and going with her to rallies, and oh God, the very first one, the crowd was so dense and I was being pulled through that I lost a shoe, so I ended up, and then I was told to get up on the stage, hurry, and just as they were throwing somebody off, so there we met halfway in the crowd. And
what happened to the shoe?
I never saw it again.
Never got the shoe.
She owes me a shoe. And the way she exercised, she had read in the Ladies' Home Journal or some such thing that it only required 20 minutes of exercise a day. That would do it, no more. So she would look at her watch, and she would start marching up and down the lawn at 70 Clifton, with me hurtling along beside with a tape recorder in her face. We did this every day.
Oh, so this was part of the ritual of the 1-hour recording, was the 20 minutes exercise?
Yes, you know. And then we had, I think the most fun was in Lahore. I don't know if Azra Khalid is here, but anyway, we were there for part of Ramadan, and inside this walled compound with all these soldiers on the outside. And in my country, they're there to protect you, but in fact, they were there with their guns pointing in, you know, and I thought, oh, what's wrong with this picture? But anyway, Benazir decided, because there was really nothing to do, and we were just sitting around, that she would do a miracle morning. She would do a makeover of me, because she used to introduce me to her friends, looking at this drab little person, as she's from Women's Lib. That's how she always introduced me. So she set upon me and did my toenails. She did my fingernails. And we got, henna was brought from the ancestral lands of the family with whom we were staying. And this concoction on my head with coffee in it. Have this ever happened to you?
No, I haven't had. I've got blonde hair.
Oh my God, it's incredible. And it was so hot, and I had to be wrapped in a towel, and the red sweat was running. Anyway, when I finally then could take the shower, and there was only a half hour or something of water a day, there was all this plink, 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 and all these twigs and pebbles were falling on the floor. But anyway, she thought I looked much better after that.
Okay, that's nice. Had your hair done by
Had my hair done, my toes. I mean, it was a miracle morning. It was great.
But obviously, given the time that you were writing the book, which again it was 1987, 1988, it was a very difficult time in Pakistan because actually things were beginning to, as we now know, come to the end of the Zia regime. Did you feel in danger at times? I mean, you were an American in Pakistan, not with the same security problems and law and order situation we have now, but nonetheless, it was dangerous to be in Pakistan. Did you experience any?
Well, I never felt in danger when I was with Benazir because she didn't. I mean, you know, I'm not going to say in danger. I never felt frightened, let's put it that way. She was always in danger. We were always in danger. But it was just part of the everyday life. And the military, the intelligence vans parked outside, you experienced all that. Wherever you went, there was a van right on your tail. And so it just became an irritation. But there was a time, a serious time, that I was frightened, and that was when I was leaving Pakistan. The first time I was there was a 6-week, which should have been enough, of taping with her. And she called me and she said, oh dear, she said, they know your name now. Because she had told me never to say my name. She said, they found out your name and you're red listed. I said, what? And she said, that means that you are known as an unwanted foreigner or something, and you are subject to search and what have you at the airport. So this was a little hairy, needless to say. So as I left 70 Clifton to go to the airport, I was picked up by one PPP car, and we drove in back roads, and then I was put in another PPP. Oh, I forgot to tell you, the whole point that I was frightened about was that I was leaving with her prison diaries. And these diaries were obviously very not flattering to General Zia, and there were all sorts of pictures of PPP members being tortured or dead, or, I mean, you know, it was pretty horrific stuff. So that was the reason of my fear, because I had these diaries over my shoulder. Anyway, we got to the airport, managed to make it to the airport, and I was escorted. I was told to follow. 2 PPP people went ahead of me. I was told to follow 10 feet behind. And there was a PPP sympathizer in immigration. We went right through him. And then they put me in the first-class lounge, and they stood outside, guarding the door, just making sure. I don't mean, it was like a scene from Argo, you know. And what happened then was there were three of us in the first-class lounge, all with identical briefcases. Who was to know? And we were all put in this sort of cart thing to go out to the plane, and they were all just put in together. So it was a shell game. You didn't know whose was whose or which was which. And I got on the plane, and I said to the stewardess, it was British Airways, I put my sister's name on. I said, if anything happens to me, make sure this gets delivered to my sister in London. And the stewardess looked at me. Then my seatmate, we sat there, and my seatmate said, oh, she said, this just happened in Sri Lanka. We got to the end of the runway, and the police came out, stopped the plane, brought it back, took people off. I thought, So, by the time the plane took off, I was an absolute wreck. I had a scotch and soda. I paid right there at 10 o'clock in the morning. But anyway.
So, I mean, this process took roughly a year of between her sort of political campaigning, doing the tapes, going through her diaries. We now get back home to the writing stage. And again, for you young ones sitting in the audience, we are dealing with technology which is not as you would all expect. I think faxes were just in their infancy, but no mobile phones,
no email.
Certainly no email or internet, or no looking up any quick fact on Wikipedia. So we are slightly in the dark ages in terms of writing. So you get home and you start down to write. I mean, the first draft took you roughly how long?
Well, I don't know, maybe 6 months.
To get to the first sort of, when you thought you'd finished.
Well.
Where did you think you'd finished the book?
Well, I thought I had finished because, you know, in that 6 weeks we'd covered a lot. And I thought this was the book.
And the ending was going to end just with her, yes, just with her in 1987, 88.
Yeah. And I can't quite remember when it was supposed to end. The point is that we're getting to is that this book never ended. I finally finished it 4 times. I was chasing a breaking news story with a book, which you really cannot do. You can do it with an article, you can do it in a newspaper, but you can't do it in a book. But we managed to do it.
And the first big event was her engagement.
Yes, so I'm just about through writing, and bingo, she suddenly announces that she's having an arranged marriage. Well, this was so shocking to everybody. So in July of 87, I'd just gotten back in May. I'm off to London, where I spend a lot of time with her and her fiancé, Asif, and I meet Begum Bhutto for the first time. She was extremely happy that Benazir was finally getting married.
Age 34. She was getting old.
Yeah, getting on there. Now we have material. We can end the book again. Not quite yet. The wedding. We all go to the wedding. Victoria.
We all go to the wedding.
We all go.
All the Westerners go in their little dresses with their one string of pearls to be met by lots of Pakistani women regaled in all beautiful wedding paraphernalia.
And we got the wonderful Mendi.
Yes, Mendi, bangles, the lot.
And even Benazir getting married, we're still working. I mean, the night before her wedding, she summons me to her bedroom. We're taping. And the lights are flickering on and off, and she's furious because she says Zia is just trying to ruin her wedding. But anyway, so...
Which also is a bit of a political wedding, because I seem to remember the reception was in Liari, which is not quite normally the place you'd have your reception, and we all bundled off.
There were two, right?
Yes.
There was one in Clifton Gardens, which was jammed. Oh, my. Everything was jammed. And then Liari, which was, to me, quite terrifying. I've never seen so many people, and they all pressed forward to see Benazir. Mm-hmm. And so I escaped down a hatch in the stage. But anyway, so we finished the book again. Terrific. Now she's married. Yay. Live happily ever after. She comes to America with her sister in April and stays at my house in Sagaponack, Long Island, right on the beach. And the point is for her to read through the book and sign off on it, and everything is going fine. We go to a local restaurant, sort of music hall. Oh, my Lord. And she and her sister, we order potato skins, and they suddenly realize there's bacon in them. So they're sitting with a candle, pulling out the bacon bits. Then Benazir orders skim milk and ice. This was an order that no one in that bar had ever. The entertainer is named Taj Mahal. I'd forgotten about the India connection. This was not clever. Who had his pants down very low in the back. Yes. And Benazir rose to the occasion by putting her head on the table and going to sleep.
She was very tired.
Oh, God. But anyway, the book was done. It was great until May 29th. And suddenly General Zia calls for elections. And they are going to be held in November. And this is where the faxes now come into play. I couldn't go back there again. No. So fax machines were illegal then in Pakistan.
Yes, as were photocopying machines. Can you believe that?
Yeah, it was really a terrible time. But there was at the hotel, some hotel.
Yeah, the international hotels would have.
Well, no, it was it was a friend's hotel.
Oh, friend's hotel. Okay.
Yes, even now I feel I can't say his name. No. But anyway, he had a fax. So, but I didn't have a fax. But my neighbor, the author John Irving, had a fax. So the faxes started coming into his house from the Benazir camps, and with a time difference, it would be like 3 o'clock in the morning, and the fax machine would go bing, 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 and wake up, and they would come out, these pages, then they're all curled. I mean, it's not like these pieces, they're a different kind of paper. So every morning, his whole living room would be littered with these little curls, and he'd go around and pick them up. And I had breakfast there every morning. We got to be excellent friends. And the book ended again because we had all these great faxes about Zia calling for elections. So,
August 17th.
Yeah, this is the third time now that the book has been ended, and the British publisher says enough. We're done. We don't have any more time. We're going to go with that where you are now. So I go on vacation.
As one does in August.
Yeah, and I'm exhausted from all this, obviously. We get up, we go to a place called Block Island. You get to it by ferry. We get off the ferry, and I'm met by the manager of the hotel that we're going to, who's got a yellow pad with all these messages on them for me, which say, Zia's plane has crashed. The vacation is over. We get right back on the ferry, go back to the mainland, and the book starts again. Excuse me, you talk for a minute while I drink.
Suddenly, you have this death of General Zia, who was sort of on the way out, but nonetheless, I think could have carried on for a lot longer. She could have married, had a child, because we haven't mentioned, but at this stage, she was also expecting her first child, Bilawal. And then suddenly, everything seems to get on a roller coaster and go fast and fast and faster. And this death of General Zia completely altered the dynamic. Out of the blue.
Absolutely out of the blue. But he had called for elections for November, which no one thought he was ever going to honor. But with his passing...
After 11 years.
Yeah.
You have to remember.
11 years he kept changing the dates. He was always going to have elections. Well, there were never elections.
Yes, I don't know if you all know, but he was called the CMLA, which was the Chief Martial Law Administrator. But in fact, in journalistic circles, he was called... the CMLA, cancel my last announcement. I don't know if you know that, but that was...
I didn't know that.
Oh, that was one of the...
So, in any event, now suddenly Zia is gone. There really are going to be elections. The book can't end before the elections. So back I go to Pakistan for the November elections, and I'm with her in Larkana, the family's ancestral home in Sindh. Amazing sight, all these women who are camped on the lawn just there and singing and dancing, and we go to Nodero, to her family graveyard. Oh my God, it was so moving, really. At that point, it was just a small walled
little cemetery. Yes.
Yeah, it was really
with sort of wildflowers growing out of them.
Yeah, and the
pathways.
wonderful gatekeeper or whatever who had been there for 500 years, and it was very intimate and lovely. And Shah Nawaz's grave was there, and of course her father, completely covered in blankets of marigolds. And she went and prayed there before the election, and she was moved, I was moved. And so then, miracle of miracles, she wins.
Yeah, that was extraordinary.
Half the party had been disenfranchised because of the voter IDs. But as of December of that year, she was named the Prime Minister.
Age 35. Again, it's extraordinary now. You think back how...
Age 34.
34, yes. How comparatively young she was.
Yeah. And at that point, she was the first elected female prime minister anywhere in the world, and one of the youngest heads
Muslim,
of state.
Yes.
And so this book, which had finished 4 times, started when she was a political dissident and ended, in the American edition, being the Prime Minister of Pakistan. Now I ask you, I mean, it was such a trip. I was so thrilled. Anyway, that was that story of writing Daughter of the East.
Did you ever get tired of her in terms of as a character? Did you feel utterly attached to her throughout the story?
Yes. You really do. I mean, it's interesting, and I do get asked that quite often. I mean, do you feel that you are the person that you're writing about? No, I never felt that I was Benazir, but I was so involved in all that she wanted and what she was aiming for that it was as if it was me.
Yes, no, I understand that. I mean, unfortunately, as we know, she had 20 more years only to live. And so really what you wrote was the end of the beginning. And in the next 20 years, she became Prime Minister twice and was assassinated on December 27th. And after her death, this film was made, which I've just mentioned, and we've seen a couple of clips. And I think one of the most dramatic clips, which brings together your writing of Daughter of the East and her subsequent life and death, is this clip we're about to see now, where you've obviously asked her a question about what it's like addressing the crowd, and she answers, and it's almost as though she's talking from the grave. Again, we apologize, the quality's not that good, but perhaps we'll just have this last clip now of the film.
I no longer care for bullets because I feel in a crowd like this, half the crowd comes to us, and I feel completely protected. My nervousness drops, my apprehension drops. I no longer care for bullets because I feel in a crowd like this, no bullets can hit me. I just feel invincible.
Sufi literature.
And suddenly I felt that in this crowd, in this rush, I could feel the martyrs come with me. They're all walking together, and that it was not lonely. So I could almost feel, and it would make me feel lighter and lighter. And I really felt elevated, you know. I just felt myself rise almost inside me, my soul or my spirit.
And that's, I personally, I've seen this film so many times, and I find that one of the most moving episodes of the film, and indeed of her life, where she really is talking to the people and describing to you in those tapes 25 years ago what it's like to stand up and talk in front of the people. And as we know, it was at the last rally at Liaquat Ali Bagh she was assassinated. Well, Linda, it's been absolutely fantastic, and I feel we've got an audience that would like to ask some questions. So perhaps if we have the lights on and we've got some mics roaming around, we can have some questions. Do we have a question? Oh, right, yes, this gentleman here, thank you.
Well, a thing that I have not been able to explain is that people educated in Western countries, they ultimately, some of them ultimately go to visit the shamans. And Benazir has been, told to us that she started visiting peers. We call them peers here. These are the so-called shamans. Is it something, a process of nemesis? Because we know that this process of nemesis can be a random one. Is it something that takes them that way? How would you explain a person educated in Western countries visiting these so-called shamans?
Linda, do you want to answer?
I didn't really understand what he was saying.
Well, I think your question, as far as I understood it, is somebody educated in the West, why did she go and visit the Sufi saints and the pirs, the graves? I think, that question really needs to be put to her in the grave. She was a very spiritual and a very religious person, but I think what sometimes people overlooked, because she'd spent 8 years of her 54-year life in the West, only 8 years, that she'd sort of somehow lost her Eastern origins. She never did. And I think her strength was that she understood the West, she liked the West, she had many friends in the West, but she really always was an Eastern person with an Eastern soul. I think it was her father wrote Western Mind, Eastern Soul, and I think that was essentially Benazir. And she was very spiritual. She did pray regularly. She had that Sufism element in her character, which is very common in Sindh.
And she was very superstitious as well. I remember her telling me that every Thursday, I can't quite remember what happens Thursdays. Yeah. Oh. Yeah. No, she was superstitious from I don't know what the later on is, but when I was working with her, she was definitely superstitious and sacrificed a goat. She didn't herself, but every Thursday night when I think the dead come back, or I can't quite remember what it was. And then she was given clothes all the time. People would throw dupatas and what have you for her, but she would never touch them or something because there was some thought that evil might come in on the clothes. I can't remember, but she was very superstitious and very, very Eastern.
We have a question here. You've got the mic.
Yes, my question is related to
Put your mic close, yeah.
Yes, did you come to disembody Benazir Bhutto, the character of the book, and Benazir Bhutto, the real person? And what I mean by that is, did you want her not to say some things? What were your expectations from the character itself? Did you at times feel that your ambition or your own imagination of the character was overpowering the actual writing process?
Is that a question to me, the
yes,
writer?
Yes.
No, I have learned, that it's not me. I can write my own books, and that's my own imagination and my own voice and my own everything. But when you work with somebody else, that book belongs to them. So never, ever do you go over, or I don't anyway, go over that line.
We had a question. Yes. Have you got the mic?
Yeah. My name is Sher Ali Khan. I'm with the Express Tribune. I'm a staff reporter there. My question is that in Daughter of the East, the beginning is a heart-wrenching tale of a daughter who loses her father, and then she goes on to lead a democracy movement, which is probably the biggest in Pakistan history. But at the end, as Prime Minister, she talks about privatization, Thatcherian economics, and a very conservative kind of economic policy. And so I wanted to understand, how she balanced that sort of, conundrum, in her politics and then her work as a prime minister. Because during her government, most of her father's policies were undone and so on.
My work with Benazir ended, really, when she became prime minister for the first time. So I am not capable of answering that question. We remained friends. I saw her every year, at least once a year. She'd come to the States, and I visited her in Pakistan, but I didn't get re-involved in the politics of it. Perhaps you could speak to that?
Well, I mean, I think this is really about writing the book, and we can't really get into a debate on Benazir's administrations, because that's not what we're meant to be talking about, I'm sorry to say. So I think it's a difficult question to answer. As I say, we're not putting Benazir's two administrations up for scrutiny. We're putting Benazir as the woman as she emerges in Daughter of the East. That's really what we're talking about. Yeah, well, I think, the situation had evolved. I mean, the way every government has views politics is different from one generation to another generation, and the sort of the socialism of the 70s had been modified into a sort of a social democratism. I remember one occasion she and I had dinner with David Owen. You may all know David Owen. He was one of the gang of four who broke away from the Labour Party and formed the Social Democrats. And one of the questions that she asked him at the dinner was, did he feel disappointed that he'd not become Prime Minister? Because had he remained in the Labour Party, he might have become Prime Minister. He was Foreign Secretary at the time of her father's execution in 1979. And he said no, because in fact both parties have modified their stance to become social democratic parties, although one's called Labour and the other's called Conservative, but they're both, the essence of their credence is social democracy. And in a way, this is what's happened in Pakistan's politics. It's changed and changed again, and I don't think that's unusual in terms of the way Benazir operated. But that's, just a broad, general answer. We have another question. Yes, this gentleman here. Okay.
Hello. What I want to ask
What's your name?
Umar.
Umar, and are you a student here?
I am a student in A-levels currently.
Okay.
What I want to ask about is, I've read Daughter of the East, and I've read another book by Murtaza's daughter, Songs of Blood and Soul. And what I'm basically interested in is, even in the book, Daughter of the East, what's really not touched upon is this relationship between Benazir and Murtaza. And, from most of the political narrative we hear in Pakistan, we hear that, some sort of rift started to come amongst the two siblings as the elections came and Zia died. And then, Murtaza didn't want her to contest the elections, and there was some sort of problems that started between the two. But we never get to hear what Benazir went through as this was happening with her brother personally, in their personal life. What was the kind of relationship that developed between them before Murtaza died, and before, everything happened and went amiss between the siblings. So if you can tell something about that.
Well, I do know, and that going back, when I was writing the book, she adored Mir and Shanwaz, but then Mir seemed to be more in favor of violence. Well, he was a boy, and he seemed more determined to overthrow the regime, and he may or may not have. It's never been determined. The Al-Zulfikar movement and the hijacking of a plane in which someone was killed, someone was shot and killed.
An Indian diplomat was killed,
Yeah,
yes, in 1981.
And this was a horrible, horrible thing to have happened, well, just in itself, but the repercussions on Benazir and her mother and on lots of members of the PPP were just extraordinary, because then the accusations from Zia and his cronies were that Benazir knew all about al-Zulfikar, that Begum Bhutto knew all about al-Zulfikar and the hijacking, and they were responsible. And that's when Benazir was put in the cell in the desert in
Sakar.
Yeah, in a cage, just left in a cage in the desert for months. And they tortured many, many, many members of the PPP to get them to say that, yes, indeed, Benazir knew all about al-Zulfikar. And so that was a difficult period, I'm sure, in her inner thoughts about Mir. And when he came back, she knew that someday he'd come back. I mean, you know, this exile can't last forever, and regimes changed and so on. And I think he had that sort of feeling of entitlement that he was the boy, the oldest, and therefore it was his realm and not hers, that she'd been sort of keeping it going for him. But I don't really know more than that. I do know that when he died, we had a long talk about it. She was so upset, sobbing. Something to do with the hospital, and they didn't have the equipment. And, you know, had he been somewhere else, he might have lived. But anyway, she was heartbroken.
Yes, I think it was a very difficult time for her. And again, I think when one's writing history, one has to contextualize what's going on at the time. And the two brothers were very angry at what had happened to Zulfikar Ali Bhutto. They were sitting in London. Again, I emphasized that there wasn't the sort of communications that we take for granted now. And they did up stumps and decamp to Afghanistan. And they'd been promised lots of weapons by lots of people. And they were essentially what they thought was freedom fighting. But it did really end disastrously with this hijacking of the PIA plane in 1981. And from then onwards, it was very difficult for them to go anywhere. Britain would not allow them in. They had a very difficult, I think, 5 to sort of 8 year period where they were persona non grata. And again, one has to put that back in context of what was happening at the time. And for Benazir, and I totally agree with you, Linda, it was very, very difficult because the Zia regime were desperate to put them all in the same category and say it was Benazir and it was Begum Bhutto who were involved as well. That was the golden opportunity they were looking for. And she did spend from 1981 till 1984 in prison, under detention, without charge. We had a question over here.
Okay, I want to ask.
Can you say who you are?
I'm a student. My name is Mahla.
Okay.
And I want to ask how feminist a woman Ms. Bhutto was. I mean, whenever we talk about strong, independent women in Pakistan, Benazir Bhutto is a name that comes up first. It's the first name that comes up. And I'm also, studying gender issues and feminism, and her name often comes up now. So. Did she really support feminist ideologies? Did she have any inclination towards that? I'm really interested in knowing that.
Do you want to
Really support what?
feminism? Do you want to answer that?
Oh, sure she did. Of course she did. I mean, in her way, we all have different ways. I mean, in America, we were thundering along, marching and carrying on. It was a lot of fun. But she, by virtue of her being who she was supporting feminism. I mean, a whole generation of young women saw what she was doing, which is the best way for any change to take place, and emulated her, saying, well, if she can do that, then I can fill in the blank, go to medical school, go to law school. I mean, we can't all be Benazir Bhutto, but she opened opportunities in the souls of people.
I remember at the time when she became Prime Minister for the first time, I was working for BBC, and I managed to get a commission to do a half-hour feature on women in Pakistan. And I did an interview with her, and I've still got the cassette tape, which I must put onto DVD, where she starts off, and I think I put the question, do you think you're a role model? And she sort of says, I do consider myself a role model, and then she talks on. But then I went and interviewed a lot of other important people, women, and they made it clear that whereas she had to, there was sort of so far she could go but no further, but behind her presence, they could work and push effectively what we call the glass ceiling in their individual professions. And I know that they felt this was hugely important, that having a female prime minister, particularly whether it was going into the media or becoming doctors, that they could anticipate and leading the sort of lives that they wanted to lead. And I would testify, having first come to Pakistan in 1978, and here we are now in 2013, the enormous change for women that I've witnessed in terms of whether I turn on my television and there's some sort of snazzily dressed presenter. There were no female presenters prior to this period. So it's terribly easy to criticize what she didn't do, but actually in terms of promoting the aspirations of other women, of course the other women had to then work, I think her legacy is enormous and lasting, irreversible. We have another question.
Yes, I have a question.
Where? Oh. Aisha, right, lovely.
I mean, it's good to see the youngsters as engaged as they are, trying to find out more about Benazir Bhutto. My question to both of you relates to the archives of Benazir Bhutto, and clearly that includes the videos that you talked about and shown. What's the extent of this? Is this open to the public? You talked about a prison diary. What's being done about Benazir Bhutto, an archive where people can go and research on aspects of her life, and that should be open to the public? Or is it just a matter of those who can have privileged access?
What a very good question, because I have absolutely no idea what the answer is. I don't know. Does anybody know? Is there a foundation or a library, or I don't know. Bashir Riaz would know. He's here.
There is a Bhutto Legacy Foundation. I think at the moment a lot of people have got a lot of archives. I've certainly got a lot of archives, and occasionally I've had people coming to talk to me and wanting to look at papers that I've got. Linda, you have got certain archives, and at some point in time there will obviously be the need to collate them and have them in one organized location. But I don't think there's any privileged access, sort of, there's nothing sinister like that. I just think it hasn't been organized yet.
Just for those who can get access, it should be to public access. I think that there's a need, and I mean, lots being achieved through this literary festival. I just want to add my voice for the need to make information accessible to the public, including, not least, Benazir Bhutto's personal archives, so that people can do research.
Why don't you do that?
Well, nobody's asked me, so.
Yeah, you know, that's the joy. It's gonna take a person who is really interested in archiving Benazir stuff to do it.
Yes, well, perhaps a little. I mean, what would happen in the British Library is that a file would be opened and papers would be donated, and it would all. Every time you put in the word Benazir Bhutto, you would be directed to all the different archives that are there, and you know that's what Pakistan National Archives needs to do. I mean, that's definitely a challenge for the Pakistan National Archives. I know, but that's the problem with the Pakistan National Archives. It's got nothing to do with that. Do we have another question here? I think we had. Do we have another? Yes, we have a gentleman over here. Is Mike there? I'm sorry, I've been talking so much over this festival, I've almost gone hoarse. Yes, can you introduce yourself?
My name is Faizan Bhatti, and I work for Dunia News. My question is, we had a lady prime minister, a superstitious lady, having CMLA phobia, and this phobia just drove her to politico-neurotic, I would say.
Oh dear.
And she is considered, I don't know how much, liable for the killing of her brothers. And we have a clip in our archive when Begum Bhutto was saying that I need my seat back from her. What would you say on this clip? And what was the true picture of mother-daughter relation?
Mother-daughter relation.
The relationship, are you asking about the relationship between Benazir and her mother? Oh, I think it was very close for a very, very long time. I mean, because they were prison mates, they were cell mates, they were persecuted together. And there's a sweet letter in the book from Begum Bhutto, who was in one jail, to her daughter Pinky, as she was called, in Succor, advising her how to cool off and to take the bucket of water that they gave them every morning, the one bucket in the cell, and to pour it over her head and to wet her clothes, and just that would keep her cool for at least 2 hours. They were very, very close. And then when Mir came home, it all fell apart. I mean, the mother and the son, and she took the side of Mir politically. But up till then, they'd been very close. And in fact, Begum Bhutto lived with Benazir all those years, and in Dubai, and recently, well, just died last year, but she always lived with Benazir.
I think we've got time for a couple more questions.
Did that answer your question?
Victoria, we're running out of time,
Yes.
actually.
I think we probably, have we got anyone? No, well, we've got any more questions? One more question? No, we haven't. Well, I'd like to thank Linda Bird Franke very much indeed for coming from the United States and the audience.